Well, welcome everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to the ESCO webinar series. I'm Paul Misen, the Deputy Director of ESCO, and I'm very pleased to introduce Cath Sleeman, the Head of Data Discovery at NESTA and a member of the ESCO Leadership Executive. Cath's got a PhD from Cambridge University, and she previously worked at Morgan Stanley as a UK economist and senior economist before that at the Reserve Bank of New Zealand. She leads at NESTA on projects that show potential of novel data and methods to deliver new insights, and her work blends economics, data science, and creative data visualization, which I expect we'll see in the presentation that's coming up. The work that she'll be presenting today uses a novel data set of online employee reviews from Indeed UK website and enhances our understanding of job quality, as she'll show. The approach takes keywords and clusters to form a taxonomy of job quality, giving the first UK taxonomy that is derived from employees' reviews and the first to be updated in real time. So we're looking forward to that. And rather than steal her thunder, I will hand over to Cath to explain how this work is useful to understand job quality. So Cath, you've got about 40 minutes, and then after that we've got John Forth, who will act as a discussant for a few minutes, and then we'll turn over to the audience. So please do submit your questions through the Q&A function, and you can do that at any point in the talk, and we'll unmute you so you can speak to ask your question if you're selected. So over to you, Cath.
Thanks so much, Paul. That's really kind. Can you hear me all right? And you can see my slides. Great. Yep. Okay, wonderful. Well, as Paul said, I'm Cath Sleeman. I help to head up the data science team at NESTA, which is a charity based in London. And today I'm going to be talking about extracting dimensions of job quality from online employee reviews. So this is actually a project that finished around a year ago, and unfortunately I don't have the data set any longer. So we just had the data set for a fixed period of time. But I'm hoping that I can tell you about some of the limitations and the benefits of working with this type of novel data in case others are interested in exploring similar data sets. So I'll start off with a little bit of background as to how this project came about in the data set itself. As you probably know, the UK doesn't have an official quality of work taxonomy or an official survey of job quality. There are surveys of job quality, very good ones, but not, not a kind of an official one. And I guess I was curious to know whether online employee reviews, so these are reviews left by employees on, in this case, Indeed's UK website, but another site you could use is Glassdoor, and they also hold online reviews. I was curious to know whether those reviews could help to improve our understanding of job quality and could act as could help us to create a first draft of that quality of work taxonomy. And we know that lots of job seekers, employees are using these types of websites to help guide their career choices. And so I guess the question is perhaps they could be helpful for us researchers as well. So this is what an employee review looks like. So you've got an example here of someone who worked at Tesco. They give an overall rating. There's a title to the review. They give us their job title, their location, and the date. And what I'm most interested in is this paragraph of text. And what I kind of wanted to try and do was to extract the dimensions of job quality that they talk about, so the aspects that affected their well-being. So in this review, for example, the person talks about learning new skills and how they had the opportunity to do that. They talk about being disappointed at the performance of management. They felt that they weren't recognised, but they did enjoy meeting new people. So these are the types of aspects that I'd like to extract and then build into this quality of work taxonomy. So that's just one review. In total, I had 1.5 million reviews that had been left on Indeed's UK site over 7 years, between 2012 and 2019. So my data set is pre-COVID, and although new reviews are constantly being added, my data set ended, at that point in time in 2019. So what was my contribution to the literature, or let's say hopeful contribution? I think as far as I know, I'm the first person to use the main text field within Indeed reviews and to look at that, what's contained within that main paragraph of text. So there are other papers who have looked at the pro and con fields. So the pro and con fields are shorter statements, kind of 2 to 3 words, things like free food or good management, that kind of phrases. And there have been papers that have looked at those, which are interesting. I just felt that the main review field offers perhaps a richer insight into people's work experience. I think this is the first paper to construct a multi-level taxonomy from these types of reviews. So other papers have extracted sets of topics at a single level of granularity. And my concern there was perhaps we might be missing some of those smaller topics. So some reviewers talk about broad issues like big themes like pay. Others talk about very specific issues, say like the commission or the bonus that they got, which kind of sits within that concept of pay. So that's why I wanted to create like a multi-level taxonomy. And then lastly, I was just very interested in the how the dimensions of job quality might vary over time and between occupations. I guess we often talk about job quality as if it's the same dimensions, that they're equally important for everyone. But I guess my hunch is that perhaps there's kind of some variation amongst occupations. So what are the benefits and limitations of working with this type of data set? There are 2 key benefits. The first is the free text. So it's a completely empty box that reviewers are faced with. They're free to mention any topic in as much or as little detail as they like. And so that's a little bit different to a survey of job quality where the surveyor in advance has to decide, I guess, a little bit constrain the respondents' queries and say, I'm going to only ask about these specific dimensions of work quality. But of course, they may, surveys may still contain free text answers, but perhaps there's slightly less freedom than in this type of data set. I think the main benefit of a data set like this is that it's timely. Like I said, mine ended in 2019, but new reviews are constantly being added. So I think that's the key benefit, that a data set like this might be able to give us insights into the kind of changing aspects of job quality in between, say, annual surveys, which are perhaps a more rigorous kind of nature. There are a couple of limitations, though, of using a data set like this, and they're principally bias and noise. There are 2 types of bias. The first, as I'm sure you appreciate, is the mix of reviewers. But the mix of reviewers are not a perfect representation of the underlying workforce. There are certain groups and occupations who will be overrepresented, and then other occupations who will be underrepresented. And I do explore that later on. The other type of bias, which is much harder to explore, is the content of reviews. So when you write a review, you know that it will be public, that others will be able to see it, and that may influence what you write. And you've also probably seen the previous reviews that have been left by your colleagues, and so that may also influence what you say. And that type of bias is much harder to get at. In addition to bias, though, there are also 2 types of noise. So the first is a bit tricky to explain and probably best given by an example here. So if someone mentions back pain, for example, did the reviewer mention that because that's part of their job? They're a physio, they're in the healthcare sector, and they help to treat people with back pain, or because they were injured as a result of their job and now they experience back pain. So that would be then part of the quality of work taxonomy. So it can be difficult sometimes to distinguish the context in which phrases are being mentioned. The other type of noise is, and this definitely affected the approach that I took, was that the reviews contain a large number of spelling mistakes and grammatical errors. So I've provided an example there below. And that did change the approach I used. In NLP, natural language processing, it's quite common to use pre-trained models, but some of these aren't used to kind of these types of spelling and grammatical errors. And so that can kind of muck up the analysis. But I'll talk about that later on. So onto that question of bias, and I was keen to explore who might be underrepresented and who might be overrepresented in this data set. So what I did was created a simple algorithm that took people's job titles and then assigned it to 4-digit SOC codes, so the official classification of occupations. And that's the kind of the names of the occupations that you can see here. And what I found is that certain groups, like those in customer service occupations, elementary occupation, they're overrepresented. So the proportion of the reviews that they make up is up to 2.5 times the proportion of employees in those occupations across the UK labour force. And then other occupations are underrepresented. So skilled trades and health professionals were underrepresented. And I think that this is complete conjecture, but I think skilled trades may be underrepresented because there's high levels of self-employment in the kind of those occupations. And so perhaps there's less use for a website, to use a website, you know, like this, and to leave reviews. And with health professionals, I wonder whether it's because there's one very large employer, the NHS. And so again, perhaps there's fewer employers to compare. And so maybe that's why there's less use of a website like this. Okay, so that was the data set. Onto the kind of method for building this quality of work taxonomy. I thought I'd explain just to begin with the kind of broad approach to the method and then go into the detail. So you have to imagine that this is a network and that every blue dot here is a noun, so a common noun that's being mentioned in the employee reviews, like salary or wage and the likes. And the distance between the nodes in the network reflects their semantic similarity, so how similar in meaning those words are. So what I want to do is create a network like this. And then in order to create the quality of work taxonomy, I need to cluster. So I need to find the groups of words that are similar in meaning to each other. But I want to create depth to that taxonomy. And so what I need to do is cluster repeatedly, essentially. And that's what gives the kind of depth that I'm after. And I do that repeatedly 5 times, so that the final taxonomy has 5 levels. So that's the broad approach. There are 2 key steps. The first is forming that network of common nouns. So what nouns are reviewers constantly mentioning in their reviews? So there's quite a lot of cleaning involved, and then I tokenize, so I break down the text into the essentially words or tokens. Lemmatization is where you reduce the form of a word back to its base form. So you do that. And then I also wanted to find bigrams. So that's just common 2-word phrases that are occurring, things like work culture and things. There's probably a better example. Then once I've done that, I need to, in order to identify the nouns, I need to find the position of each token. So is it a noun? Is it a verb? Is it an adjective? Because I just want the nouns. That's what I'm after. And then I really just want the common nouns, so those nouns that are appearing frequently. So I exclude stop words, so those are those little kind of words that occur frequently. I remove words that weren't tagged as a noun that frequently, so perhaps they've been mistagged. The kind of the tagger, the thing that identifies a word as being a noun or a verb or an adjective, it's not always 100% accurate. So if a word wasn't tagged as a noun that frequently, then it got removed, and very rare words were removed too. And then I train a word-to-vec model. And word-to-vec is quite an almost old school approach now with the newer large language models. And the reason I did that is the sheer number of spelling mistakes. That I tried pre-trained models, and you can fine-tune pre-trained models, and I think that would have been an alternative approach. But I just found that word-to-vec handled the spelling errors and the grammatical mistakes far better than perhaps newer, kind of newer, deeper neural networks did. So what the word-to-vec model gets you is a vector of numbers that corresponds to each word. So it's context independent embeddings. Some of the newer approaches to embeddings are context dependent, so that numerical vector varies for each word depending on the context in which the word is mentioned. Here you've just got a fixed vector that represents every word. And what that allows you to do is then measure the distance between any two words, because now the word is represented by a vector of numbers. So if you ask the model, what words are most similar to manager, then the most similar word in this model is manager, like a misspelling of manager. And then it says, well, the next most similar is supervisor, regional manager, GM, general manager, and TL, team leader. So it's picking up acronyms and things. And I was really pleased to see that. So this is the first step. So we formed a network of nouns, about 3,500 single words and bigrams. And the edge weights are those cosine similarities between the words. So kind of capturing how similar the words are. The next step then is to repeatedly cluster that network to create the taxonomy. And there's a couple of different steps involved in that. So you could just cluster once at each level and put the words into groups. The trouble is that each time you cluster, you'll get a slightly different result. That's a little bit unstable. So those authors mentioned there in their 2018 paper, they came up with a more stable approach to clustering, so a type of consensus clustering. And so the way that works is that rather than cluster just once, you cluster multiple times and you store the results of those clusterings. And then you create another network. And the nodes of that network are the same as in the initial network, they're just the words. But the edge weights are no longer the cosine similarities. Instead, they're how many times those words, this is just roughly speaking, how many times those words co-occurred, found themselves to be in the same cluster when you ran all those clusterings in the step before. So that gives us a new, perhaps more stable network. And then we cluster again repeatedly. And we find that we kind of calculate the adjusted mutual information score for each of those clusterings. And we find the clustering that's most representative of the other clusters. And that's our final cluster. So it's a bit convoluted, but the hope is that we've perhaps found a more stable clustering than if we'd just done it the once. And of course, that just gets us one level of the taxonomy. So we do that 5 times to get the different levels. And then the final kind of part of the methodology is naming the clusters. So we want to be able to describe the words that live in each part of the taxonomy. And there are lots of different ways to do it. And this is just one way that I use. And I found the 3 words within each cluster that are most similar in terms of their embeddings to the other words that lived in that cluster. So on to the results, hopefully that's a bit more interesting. There are 4 main findings that I'm going to talk about. And the first is taking a step back and looking at the whole taxonomy and comparing it to other taxonomies that are out there, kind of what others have found. And I felt that there might be a few dimensions that come out of this taxonomy that are a bit different to those that we normally talk about. So this is the first 2 levels of the whole taxonomy, the result of that method that I described before. So you can see at the first level, there are 4 main branches of words. And it's that top branch that I'm really interested in, and all the results that I'm going to talk about next come from analysing this top branch. And that's what I call the quality of work taxonomy. It's where people talk, it's the words that are used to describe people's work experience. The other branches are, they're interesting, but they're different types of words. So the second branch is where people describe where you work and your job title, perhaps. And the last 2 branches, again, interesting, it's with the kind of words that reflect what people do at work, their skills and the tasks that are involved. So again, interesting, but slightly different focus there. So I'm just going to talk about that top branch. So if we expand that out, this is then the first 3 levels of the quality of work taxonomy. And I appreciate the words are probably far too small in that third set of branches there. But again, there are 4 branches that the quality of work taxonomy has. The first branch is all about who you interact with at work. So it captures terms like colleague and co-worker and client and customer and the kind of relationship that you had with other people at work. The second branch broadly captures the terms and benefits of working. So lots of words to do with pay and remuneration, but also things like recognition and praise, and things like opportunities for progression and advancement. The third branch is I've called what happens when work goes well. So people talk about feeling fulfilled, that they were suitably stretched and challenged in their role. There was an air of professionalism and the likes. And then the final branch perhaps could be described as what happens when work goes badly. So it captures words that are mentioned that people use to describe negative work experiences. So you can see their incompetence, racism, but also external events. So negative events like cutbacks and uncertainties, disruptions, and things like warnings as well. So those are the four broad areas of the work taxonomy. The question then is, how do we compare that to other taxonomies that are out there? And it's necessarily subjective, I should say. The taxonomy that I chose to compare my taxonomy to is one that's produced by the CIPD, and they use it for their survey of job quality, which is called the Good Work Index. And it has 7 dimensions. It was based on another taxonomy that had 6, and they split one dimension into 2. And then another group I should mention, the Measuring Job Quality Working Group, they took those 7 dimensions and they came up with metrics, so measures that you could use to capture each dimension, which is really interesting. So I'm comparing my taxonomy to these 7 dimensions and those 18 metrics that the group came up with. So in terms of how my quality of work taxonomy differs from that one, I think there are 2 key differences. The first is that there's a whole cluster of words in my taxonomy that relate to non-financial recognition, and that's not talked so much in like traditional quality of work taxonomy. So people talk about being recognised for their work, being praised, appreciated, being thanked, and the like. So it's, it appears to be important to workers, which perhaps not too surprising. But perhaps it could be something that's asked about in surveys of job quality to confirm how important it is. The other dimension that gets talked about a lot is quite ephemeral. It's atmosphere, culture, the environment of an organisation. So what is it like to work in that place? So people talk about the mood, the surroundings, the workplace culture. And I'll come back to that later on as well. And that's often not asked about. So, I appreciate it's probably hard to ask about in a survey. And then the last 3 differences, they're all along a similar theme. So they all relate to the kind of comments left by reviewers about the behaviour of senior management or those who run the organisation. And I thought it was interesting because quite often in surveys of job quality, we talk about the relationship with we ask about the relationship with your line manager, so that person who's immediately above you. But perhaps there are fewer questions about things like philosophy and vision, so how you thought the organisation was run and how that affected your kind of enjoyment of the job. Also the transparency, the integrity with which other people across the organisation, the way in which they acted, and your trust in others' competency. So you can see some kind of negative words there about people's feelings on that issue. So again, they seem to be, it's not just your immediate relationships that matter, it's kind of your impression of the broader way in which the organisation is run. Finding 2, I've only got a single slide on this because I felt perhaps it wasn't that surprising. So I wanted to look at the topics or the words that managers mention in 2 different parts of the taxonomy and compare those to the words that those who aren't in management mention. So what I did was I identified a set of words that would mark someone out as being a manager in their job title, perhaps like GM and TL and manager and the likes and director. And then I used the Word2Vec model to expand that list to ensure that I had kind of every title possible. And what I found was that if you look in the work terms and benefits cluster, managers spoke more about career progression than those who weren't in management. They spoke more about the benefits rather than the base pay of a job, and they spoke more about the support that they received. Non-managers made more reference to base pay, like the basic salary, the expenses and how they were kind of what they could claim for, and the time, so the amount of hours that they spent working. And then on, in terms of that negative, that final event, that final branch of the taxonomy, what I've called negative events, managers, they spoke more about external events like recessions and having to make cutbacks. And so those external events and the impact that it had on managing people. Non-managers made more reference to their treatment, how they were treated by others, and their thoughts about, as I mentioned, the kind of broader organisation, how it was run, and the impact of that on their mental and physical health. So that's the second finding. And then third looks at how the drivers of work quality may be evolving over time. I was curious to see whether the words that people have used, how they have changed. But before doing that, the first check I had to run was that the people leaving reviews hadn't changed significantly. So I looked at how the reviewers and the broad occupation groups that they belong to, how that had or hadn't changed over time. And to my relief, they're fairly constant, the mixture of occupations. There hadn't been large changes in that. But that doesn't rule out, of course, significant changes in the makeup of those who are leaving reviews within each of those broad groups. So how has word use changed over time? So what I did was I split the sample into two equal subsamples in terms of the number of reviews. So there's an early batch of reviews and then a later batch of reviews. And what I found is that mentions about quality of work, so those words that live in the quality of work taxonomy, they had grown. So people had talked more about quality of work, in the latter period than they did in the former. And so I was curious to know what words had contributed most to that growth. And this is what this chart shows. And there are three key kind of findings. The first is very minor. There's a switch in terminology. So in the earlier period, people tended to speak about their co-workers, and then that changed to mentions of staff. And I can explain, I think, why that took place. The second finding is perhaps more interesting, that reviewers they began to make more references to their workplace as a whole. So that concept I talked about before, like many more references to like atmosphere, culture, and the kind of workplace environment. And then the third finding was that people began to talk more about work terms and benefits more frequently. So what they were being paid, how long they worked for, opportunities for progression and training and things. So those were the kind of three key findings. I guess one of my concerns, though, was perhaps these changes had come about because of changes in the prompts that indeed leave reviewers. So when you leave a review, you get a blank box, but next to the blank box in which you write, there's some prompts, indeed gives you ideas on what you might like to write. And there was a change in these in 2017. And I think that explains some of my findings. So they dropped the word co-worker. So I think that's why we saw the reduction there in mentions of co-workers. And perhaps a bit more worryingly, they introduced the term workplace culture. And so if you track mentions of workplace culture in the top right-hand corner there over time, you can see that it did increase from a very small base and to still quite, it's not mentioned that frequently, 1.4% of all reviews kind of mention it at the peak. But I think that can explain some of the increase. But I think that change in the prompt was reflecting perhaps a broader trend that they were seeing in the reviews. So words like atmosphere, environment, culture, they were already on the rise. So reviewers were already talking about them more. And then there was this change in the wording of the prompts, and that gave it even more of a boost. That's to explain that finding. And then the other finding was around work terms and benefits, that they had become more frequently mentioned over time. And you can see these words, mentions of hours, pay, training opportunities, they're more kind of steady increases. So I'm not as worried that it was changed by a cause in the prompts. But I think there are a couple of different interpretations to this result. We could say that perhaps these kind of aspects of work quality have become more important to reviewers than they were, or that reviewers feel more confident, more trusting of the site, like more confident that their anonymity will be retained or maintained, and they feel more open and to talk about these perhaps more like kind of private issues. So there's those two different explanations there that we have. And what I did is I looked at all the words that had become more frequently mentioned between the two periods, so not just those that appear in the quality of work taxonomy per se. And what you do see, there has been a slight shift over time, perhaps to more perhaps to like franker language. So some of the words that have become more, significantly grown are things like favoritism, clueless, liar, etc. Those words are still used very rarely. They're not words that appear frequently, but the number of times that they're used has grown significantly between the two periods. So it does support that kind of second interpretation. Perhaps people feel more able to talk about these features of the job. And then the last and final finding is I was curious to know how the importance of the different dimensions varied by occupation. Can we talk about quality of work kind of uniformly, or does it mean quite different things to folks in different jobs? So to do that, I looked at the occupations to begin with, so starting quite broad, the occupations that are most likely to mention work environments, like words like atmosphere, environment, and then those occupations that are most likely to mention make references to pay, so pay, wage, salary, etc. And what you find is a bit of an inverse relationship. So those occupations that are most likely to mention atmosphere and environment are least likely to mention pay, and vice versa, which is really interesting. And so I wanted to dive into that a little bit more. And so that was at the occupation level. So what I then did is went down to the job title level. And what I find there, and it really, perhaps it's not too surprising, that roles in hospitality, I guess where you're surrounded by your co-workers and other people more generally, the atmosphere and environment, perhaps is more important, and you're more likely to then mention it in a review. Occupations that are least likely to mention atmosphere and environment, most likely to mention pay, are perhaps slightly more isolated roles, occupations like drivers, where you're not working perhaps as closely with colleagues, and so perhaps understandably atmosphere and environment is not quite as important there. And then just finally, there were several jobs that involved working with children, and I think maybe one working with animals, a veterinary assistant, that were least likely to mention pay. And I thought that was interesting as well. It suggests that kind of other features of the job may be more important. So those are the 4 key findings. So I guess a kind of one potential finding is that there are a few other dimensions of work quality that we might like to consider when composing surveys of job quality, that managers and non-managers talk about different issues, that the drivers of job quality may be changing over time, but there are these other kind of confounding factors there to consider, and that the importance of each aspect of work quality does seem to vary quite a lot between occupations. So that's important to bear in mind. I just identified 3 directions for future research. As I said, I don't have the data set any longer, but I thought others, if they're interested in a data set like this or they have access to one, then I think these are the kind of areas I'd focus on. The first is, I think I mentioned this right at the start, that you might be able to use something like this automated approach to create the first draft of an official quality of work taxonomy for the UK. I think it could also serve as an early warning system as well. So if you had an annual survey of job quality, perhaps you could use a data set like this in between to detect sudden changes in the kind of aspects that drive job quality. And then a couple of further research ideas, just in case others were interested. So I thought it would be really interesting to compare or to examine the impact that COVID-19 had on the dimensions of job quality. So my data set ended in 2019, but I think it would be interesting to make that pre and post comparison. And also to explore the impact of the cost of living crisis. And more generally, how does the economic cycle affect what reviewers talk about in their reviews? And that is it. So yeah, thank you so much. And yeah, really look forward to hearing John's comments and just having that broader discussion on job quality. So I will stop screen sharing.
That's great. Thank you very much, Cath. And well, I'll pass on to John, but before I do that, please do put your questions into the Q&A so we can follow up with some further comments and questions for Cath after John's comments. So over to you, John.
Thanks very much, Paul. Thanks very much, Cath. Yeah, delighted to have the opportunity to discuss the paper. I know the paper a little bit, so I have an advantage in that respect, and I know a bit of the wider literature on the measurement of job quality. And I've also dabbled myself a little bit in text analysis, so hopefully I can comment on the contribution of Cath's excellent work here. I've got a few things to say. Firstly, I think the first question is, well, why measure it in the first place? You know, why is this something that we ought to have at the top of our agenda for measurement in any case? And a key reason is there's a very well-established and a sizable association between job quality and well-being. So just to give an indication of that, I'm going to show you a graph from a paper by Francis Green, Ying Zhu, and others, looking at the importance of job quality for general well-being. And what they do in this paper is they use data from the European Working Conditions Survey, which, as Cath mentioned, is a very well-established vehicle for measuring job quality. They measure job quality across 7 specific domains, and they create a job quality index, and then they look at the relationship between that job quality index and a measure of people's psychological well-being. And in the paper, they have multiple countries, but I've highlighted the result for the UK here with the red box around the UK bar. What you see here is that a person's job quality in the UK typically explains about 15% of the variance in their psychological well-being on this WHO index. And that's a pretty sizable number. So Francis and his colleagues put it into some context in the paper. They make the point that it's similar to the impact of our physical health on our well-being and greater than the impact of our marital status or our household income. Okay, so job quality is a really key driver of how we feel ourselves, this effective well-being, which is obviously a key focus of policy interest. So it's important to measure it. How would we normally do this? As Cath says, the standard approach is to use social surveys. And what we would do there is we'd have a question battery that might go into a labour force survey, skills and employment survey, working conditions survey, or as Cath says, the CIPD surveys. And what we'd have there is a well-specified set of domains, either theoretically or empirically grounded. We would ask those specific sets of questions of all of the respondents to the survey, and each of those questions would have a defined measurement scale. So really the emphasis there is very much on systematic measurement of things that we as the researchers think are interesting and worthy of measurement. So we can systematically measure patterns and trends, so differences between subgroups, men and women. And I notice in the chat there's a question about the gender differences in your results, Cath. But of course, we can only do that for subgroups where the sample sizes are big enough. And we know that in most social surveys, we always run out of sample size at some point. And we can also only measure changes over time if those surveys are repeated and have those consistent measurements. But there's the additional advantage with a social survey that when these questions around job quality are put in the social surveys alongside various other measurements, we can do quite a lot more because we can look at the value of the different dimensions of job quality by assessing their association with measures of health, well-being, quits and so on. So obviously Francis's work I just referred to looks at the association with well-being. We can also start to identify job drivers of job quality because when we can look at an employee's other responses about maybe the way in which their workplace is regulated. You know, do they have unions or do they have bargaining power themselves? And how does that affect their job quality? And we can also look at the impact of social and economic change. Cath mentioned the COVID pandemic. So this is our sort of standard approach with its pros, the systematic measurement, and its limitations around maybe sample sizes, regularity, and so on. So what do I think then that this particular paper adds to that area? I think its main contribution here and its main value is that it takes a very different approach right from the get-go, based on free text. So there's no restriction for the employee on the issues that they might be willing to raise here. Cath didn't, I noticed in your slides, Cath, you didn't, I think, explicitly show the prompt. So just for the audience here, I think it's worth just highlighting that. And the prompt that an employee is given, they're asked to give their opinion about a typical day at work, what they learned, their management, their workplace culture, the hardest part of the job, and the most enjoyable part of the job. So we have this really, a guided response, but the employee is free to mention those things that they think are most salient. And I think that's one of the key values, because then when you combine that with the very large samples that you have, Cath, you're able to really get a very high degree of granularity. And I think what that allows you to do is to reveal a number of prominent domains, which, as you say, might not have high-level representation in some of our existing measures. So in particular, I was interested that you noted non-financial recognition, and there's a good research literature around the value of praise and recognition for employees in how they feel about their job and their workplace. You noted atmosphere, culture, environment, and then these things which are more around leadership, I would say, philosophy, the vision that the leader might set out, the transparency and integrity of the leader, the degree of trust. And we know in the research literature that these things in particular have a contribution to employees' feelings of engagement, motivation, and commitment to the workplace. So I think the ability to draw those out was really a strength of your approach. And I would agree with you. I think then this does have the potential in some way to guide future survey design. Now, some people might say that some of these things around leadership are not necessarily job quality per se, but they do affect employees' experience of their work. So they are worthy of measurement. So yes, I think there's an opportunity here to guide future survey design. And the fact that you've got these repeated observations in these kind of data sets allows us to identify how employee priorities change. But I use my language carefully there at the end, because notice that I haven't said it allows for us to identify changes in job quality. It allows us to identify changes in the things that employees mention, but I think there's a limit in how what value or what value we put on those changes. So let me just say a little bit more about what I mean there. We have no control here over the data collection or response process. We're at the mercy of the channel, the prompt. So we're at the mercy of who visits the job board, who posts a review, the prompts they're given, and what they choose to mention. So there are some unknown variations or biases there, but and the free text is hard to pass. So you notice some of that in your paper. I mean, Cath's paper has a very careful exposition. If you're wanting to get into this kind of stuff, then Cath does a very good job of explaining her methodology. And there's a lot of learning that we can have there, but there's a huge amount of pre-processing that comes from this reliance on the free text. There's a limit, I think, to what we can discern through these more, let's say, basic vectorization approaches, word to vec. So is back pain something that you experience, or is it something that you're treating? Maybe there's some potential to do more with more sophisticated approaches. You mentioned that, Cath. Maybe these more sophisticated embedding models might give us more of an understanding of the context of phrases and how they're used in the reviews. But I think the biggest challenge here is to interpret the signal. We have no measurement scale, and actually we have no measure. If somebody talks about their working hours, at the moment, it's very difficult to discern whether they're talking about that in a positive light or a negative light. when they talk about the integrity of the leader, are they mentioning that in a positive frame or in a negative frame? And I think that's certainly a significant challenge here, because only once we are able to interpret the direction or the value of some of those statements, then only then can we really start to make proper inferences, I think, about what we might take from differences across groups or changes over time. So I wonder whether there's some opportunity for people who are going on to do more of this in the future, perhaps to add some sentiment analysis or something around that, so that we're able to better support value judgments around the changes or the differences that we see. So in summary, not a substitute for a survey, I would say, but definitely complementary to the survey methods that are out there, and certainly helpful us in showing us more of the dimensionality of job quality, perhaps, but maybe its value in actually measuring the level of job quality might depend on us being able to infer a little bit more from the what people are really indicating when they mention certain terms in the reviews. So I'll stop my comments there, Paul, so that we have some opportunities for others to speak. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, John. I don't know, Cath, do you want to take a few seconds just to respond to any of those comments, or should we gather some more questions?
No, just to say thank you so much for such a lovely review or discussion. I really agree with all the points raised. I think I see this as a data set that's just one potentially helpful ingredient to a whole monitoring system for job quality. So you'd never use it as your kind of main indicator of job quality. You certainly wouldn't use it to assess the level, but I think it can give you some interesting insights on like I say, the dimensions of job quality, but only to be used in addition to surveys and other methods of following job quality. Yeah, no, thank you so much.
Okay, well, we've got some questions in the Q&A chat. There's one asked by an anonymous person. I'll ask it on their behalf, but extend it. So they're asking, I think John referred to this in his comments, are there any differences between how men and women review jobs? But could you broaden the response to that by letting us know, what difference does it make if we look at other demographics, their age, their education level, other things, if you can measure those?
It would be so interesting. But unfortunately, I only
can't.
had the same data that you see on Indeed's website, so I can't tell whether someone's a man or a woman. I think the closest you would get would be to the ONS has quite good data on the gender breakdown by occupation. And so you could use that to perhaps look at certain occupations that are very male or female, dominated. But no, I didn't know, unfortunately.
Thank you very much. Well, that's something that would be really, if we could find some way of discovering that, would be really interesting. Okay, let me turn to now. Stephen Overell has got a question here, and it comes back to something that John mentioned about the subjective measurement. So, Stephen, do you want to ask your question? Just unmute yourself and speak. Thanks.
Sure. Yes. Hello. I hope you can hear me okay.
Yep.
So John did touch on this, and I'd be very interested in Cath's thoughts about it, really. So in the sort of literature of job quality, there's two big traditions, if you like. There's the subjective one, which is what employees think and feel about their work, and there's the more objective one, which looks at jobs irrespective of what they think. So pay level, contract type, hours of work, and so on. So two big traditions, and I see this highly novel and new analysis as being in the subjective camp. So for that reason, I was wondering if you think that limits its policy relevance, because most, but by no means all, policy-related indicators tend to be in the objective side of the house, if you like. But so I was just wondering if you think that does limit its policy relevance, in that it's a contribution to the subjective view.
And is the assumption, that's such an interesting question. Thank you for explaining it so clearly. So is the assumption then that's a subjective, because it's something is subjective, it's somehow less important?
Not not necessarily, no. It's just that there is this distinction that exists in the literature, and people argue it in different ways. So some people favour one view and the others favour the other view, and there's a bit of a to and fro between the two. But I don't think one is necessarily more important than the other. But it could be that one is more amenable to uses in policy contexts.
I'm just not sure about that last step. That's if it's subjective, then perhaps it's less useful. Because I guess I'd be really interested to. This is what I guess the reviews are capturing employees' feelings. I guess, and if they're even if it's kind of subjective feelings on an objective thing, like a type of contract, I think that's really interesting. So say there's a new type of contract comes out, at zero hours when that was first introduced, then I'd be really curious as a policymaker to know people's subjective feelings about it. Did they see it as something that gives them more freedom in their work, or is it something that creates great uncertainty and instability kind of in their earnings? So I'm just not quite sure about that final jump, that if we're just getting someone's subjective feelings on a topic, that it might not be as relevant for policy. I'd say in some ways I'd almost be more interested in that as a kind of policymaker. I think in terms of what the reviews capture, it's a bit of both, isn't it? Like a lot of it is subjective. I totally agree with you on that. But then there's the odd mention of something that would be objective, like a contract type or hours that they worked or the pay that they received. So I do agree that kind of creates some difficulty in like disentangling those, because like you say, traditionally the literature is split down those two quite different kind of interpretations. There's the subjective and then the objective.
Can I just come in briefly there? Because I think, as you say, Stephen, there's this division in the literature, and on the one hand, you might see the objective measures as being more the things that the policymakers or the researchers decide are important, so the problems of long working hours, for example, whereas individual employees might not necessarily feel that they are things that negatively affect their experience of work. But that's where I see the value of this particular method, is it does allow the employee to reveal things which they themselves feel shape their experience of work, which might mean that we reveal some things which are not necessarily in the center of our viewpoint. Do you see what I mean? So I absolutely take your point, Stephen. There are values of both, but I think in the sense that this method is both subjective and free of constraints, does give it some advantages in revealing things which we might not otherwise have at the center of our vision.
Great. Well, let me move the discussion on to William Fleming, who's asked a question. Do you want to unmute yourself, William, and ask your question?
Hi there. Yeah, I was just wondering whether you looked at differences between. Oh, sorry, I should say that I think the research is really interesting, and especially using this kind of data. Yeah, whether there's differences between current and former employees. So even in the review, example review that you put up there, you can see that it says a former employee has given that response. So I wonder if you looked at those differences, and also whether the route in which people supplied the review, whether that produced any differences in the types of dimensions mentioned by people. So, some people will give a review based on a give to get, where to actually see the reviews, you need to give one, or whether it was prompted when they're uploading the CV, all these kind of response routes.
Such good questions, thank you. On the second one, I unfortunately it's one of those cases again where I don't know how they left the review, whether they were browsing or how they kind of came to leave it. My sense is that if you go to the website now, you can't just scroll through all the reviews. You do have to give to get, like kind of register or leave a review. And I think that's the same on Glassdoor as well. But I think when I started this, you could you could just kind of browse the reviews, leave one if you want to, or just read them. So I think there's more freedom there. But I didn't have that kind of that data point, unfortunately, to look at. But that would be really, really interesting. We might have, I guess, if we knew the date when those extra controls were added, we might be able to discern something from that. The first question too is fantastic. So I didn't do that, but that is very doable. So I did know from the data set, I think there was a variable indicating whether someone is a former or current employee. And that would make for an interesting comparison as well. Yeah.
Yeah,
No,
just I just asked because I'm also working with some data from Indeed.
Okay. Oh,
And
brilliant.
the big challenge is that it's all people who well, mostly people who are job seekers. So they're the more unsatisfied of the workforce.
Okay.
And so it would be very interesting whether what looks like job quality to people dissatisfied with their job is different to those who are more satisfied. And when I've been looking at it, the former employees give harsher and more critical reviews because it's maybe after they've moved on or they've got a new job or they've been, I don't know, maybe even made redundant, something like this. So that's what sort of inspired that question.
Oh, no, that would be super interesting. I was also keen to look at, there are some companies who have huge numbers of reviews, because they're just large employers and often in sectors like retail where there's perhaps higher rates of turnover. And I was keen to look at, I didn't, but keen to look at how the kind of reviews that are left immediately before yours might shape or kind of perhaps influence what you write, and are you more likely to touch on similar themes? But yeah, lots of research ideas there.
Yeah, great, thanks.
No, thank you.
Okay, thank you, William. So let me ask one final question. Did you see any differences after COVID, and particularly around people working from home or working remotely? Has that changed reviews in any way?
Well, unfortunately, my data set ended in 2019.
Okay,
Yeah,
so you
sorry,
haven't.
once again.
Maybe another one for a follow-up.
But I think it would make for a fascinating study to look at how the dimensions of work quality had changed over time, and whether, like you say, home working and different aspects have become more important, and perhaps more important for just some occupations, because we tend to think we can all work from home, but of course lots of occupations can't. And so I think that would be interesting to see whether those dimensions have shifted for some groups more than others. Sorry, John, did you want to add?
Well, I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but I noticed that Alan Felsted's on the call and he has looked at exactly that issue. So I don't know whether you want to comment, Alan. Feel free to decline.
Yes, thanks a lot for that. Hopefully you can hear me. Yeah, I was thinking about entering this discussion to make that point. Yes, Cath, we have done something, again, I think something novel, hopefully novel, is we've, myself, Francis Green and Rhys Davis have devised a howgoodismyjob.com quiz. It's a job quality quiz. It's called howgoodismyjob.com. It runs now, so you can have a look at it if you're interested. And it's been running since 2018, obviously before the pandemic. It's driven by social media marketing, so that's the kind of peaks of our traffic are dependent on when we get funding to do that. But we have 50,000 quiz takers before the pandemic and 50,000 quiz takers after the pandemic. So we've absolutely looked at that issue, albeit based on a skewed sample. But we've looked at several dimensions of job quality, the ones that you mentioned, Cath, and measured them over time. And the short answer is, have things got better or worse? Across a whole suite of indicators, they got better. Why is that? It seems to be, yes, as you mentioned, Paul, earlier, remote working is very much driving those changes, particularly with regard to autonomy at work, being able to balance work and life, having more control over what people do and how they do it. And that's driven really because remote working has become more common further down the occupational spectrum. It obviously doesn't benefit drivers, for example, Cath and people like that, but it is benefiting a lot more people than it used to, and that seems to be driving the upward shift in job quality. If anybody's interested, the paper, just to plug it, why not? It's in the Industrial Relations Journal, and it's 2023.
Great. Well, thanks very much, John, for bringing Alan into that discussion. That was a really helpful contribution. So I think we've had a really fascinating insight into job quality from those data that you shared with us, Cath, and thank you to all the people who asked questions, and no doubt there are more sort of that weren't actually articulated, but I think you're to be congratulated in using this really novel data set, using a very innovative methodology, and visualizing it so incredibly well. I'm sure that the visualization helps to promote usage. So congratulations, and I look forward to any future work you do in this. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, John,
so
for your
much. That's really
comments
kind.
as well.
Yeah, thank you
you.
to John. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.